Hi, I'm Dan Heber, and this is the lecture video to accompany the readings about Gilbert Ryle and the theory of logical behaviorism. And in the previous lecture video, the previous reading assignment, was Descartes and his theory of dualism. Sometimes it's called substance dualism, sometimes it's simply called Cartesian dualism. And we remember that according to Descartes, mind is a kind of stuff, it is a kind of substance. It is this non-material stuff. And the reason why Descartes' theory is called dualism is because, as the name implies, two different types of stuff. You have this material stuff and you have this non-material stuff. And as it turns out, according to Descartes, the non-material stuff is mind. So we can understand mentality and cognition and mental events and mental states purely in non-physical, non-material terms. We're going to be jumping ahead about 300 years and talking about the British philosopher Gilbert Ryle. And in the lecture video about Descartes, I pointed out that a lot of philosophers are dissatisfied with Descartes because he's ultimately unable to answer the question of how something immaterial or non-material like mind can interact with something physical like brain. And the first person to actually ask that question was one of Descartes' contemporaries, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. And you won't find her name mentioned at all in the textbook. Of course, textbook written by John Chaffee, male, and philosophy has a deplorable history whenever it comes to, leaving out and purposefully circumscribing, in some cases, the intellectual contributions of women and female philosophers. But Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia had a formidable intellect, and she engaged in a years-long correspondence with Descartes. And to this day, we have about 58 letters that exist that were exchanged between them. And of course, they were exchanging letters in the 1640s. And so the fact that we have 58 of those letters that are extant, that we know of, suggests that there's probably a lot more, correspondence that actually took place between them. And as I already mentioned, one of the questions that Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia asked Descartes is, well, how is it possible? You're saying that mind and body interact. How? And again, what Descartes suggested was the pineal gland. And it's I'm laughing. I can hardly say that with a straight face, because notice that to say that the mind and body interact through the pineal gland doesn't answer the question, because the question is, how can something non-physical, the mind, interact with something physical, the brain? Well, Descartes points to this physical gland, which is in the brain, by the way, called the pineal gland. And notice that that's not answering the question that we need answered, right? And the question that we need answered is, how is it possible for any non-material thing to interact with any material thing? And so Gilbert Ryle is going to be sort of continuing in this intellectual tradition of asking the same question that Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia asked back in the 1640s. Excuse me. So, behaviorism. The title of it, behaviorism, usually in philosophy class, it's we get more specific. Well, we'll say logical behaviorism, is because we're trying to separate, because we have two different theories that both go by the title of behaviorism. There's the psychological theory of behaviorism developed by B.F. Skinner about the same time as Gilbert Ryle was writing. And then, of course, you have this philosophical theory of behaviorism. So to differentiate between those two, we call the philosophical version of behaviorism logical behaviorism. So if I sort of, forget that more technical and correct language and just use the word behaviorism, you'll have to forgive me and just sort of, just translate that into logical behaviorism. And whereas B.F. Skinner and his version of behaviorism is about psychology and saying that we can change human psychology by enforcing certain behaviors, by conditioning people to behave in certain ways, we can change their psychology. That's not what Gilbert Ryle means by behaviorism. What Gilbert Ryle means by behaviorism is simply the idea that mind, we make claims about other people's mental states on the basis of what it is that we're observing. And notice that we're not observing somebody's non-material, spiritual, mental stuff. That's not what we're observing. What we observe is somebody's behavior. And perhaps you've encountered this, or perhaps you've even engaged in a form of behaviorism yourself. If you've ever been asked the question, or asked somebody else the question, are you feeling okay? You don't seem like yourself. Now you just think of why somebody would ask you that question, right? Why would somebody ask you the question, are you feeling okay? Why would somebody make the statement, you don't seem like yourself? Because they notice something about your behavior. They notice something about your body language, your facial expressions. They're picking up on that information. Of course, that information is perceptual information. And so we make a claim. We can say that, well, our friend is sad. Well, how do you know that your friend is sad? Of course, being sad is a mental state, right? Well, how do you know that your friend is sad? Well, your friend is, sitting there, shoulders are rounded over. They have this, this poor body posture. Maybe their eyes are red. You might even see tears strolling down their face, right? You notice all of those things, all of those behaviors about your friend, and then you make a claim about their mental state. And so what Ryle is going to do is simply say, well, that's what mind is. Mind is just a collection of behaviors. It's not a kind of stuff. So he's going to be rejecting Descartes for a variety of reasons that we're going to be talking about here. And what he's going to be suggesting is that, well, what we're going to replace Descartes' theory with is this other theory called behaviorism. So that's what we're going to be talking about. That's what I'm going to be talking about in this video. And the ideas that we're going to be addressing come from Ryle's major work, The Concept of Mind. So notice that he's not saying the concept of brain, he's saying the concept of mind. And what Gilbert Ryle is going to be doing is offering an interpretation of what mind is and what we mean whenever we talk about mind. And he points out here, he kind of gives some history of the problem about how philosophers have traditionally approached this topic of mind, and he sort of traces that up to the time of Descartes, and then the sort of like the intellectual history that's been handed to us since the time of Descartes, in that 350, 370 years. And what Ryle is saying here is that Descartes' view of the world leads to certain difficulties that prevent us from having a proper understanding of what mind is. So just to read these two pink highlighted passages. Human bodies are in space and subject to the mechanical laws which govern all other bodies in space. Bodily processes and states can be inspected by external observers. So a man's bodily life is as much a public affair as are the lives of animals and reptiles, and even as the careers of trees, crystals, and plants. So remember Descartes' dualism. Physical stuff, that's what Ryle was just describing, which is public, which is available, right? Everybody can witness a body, a physical body, and its interaction with its environment. But Descartes also suggests that there's this other stuff, this non-material, this non-physical stuff called mind. The second paragraph, that's where Gilbert Ryle is addressing that. But minds are not in space, nor are their operations subject to mechanical laws. The workings of one mind are not witnessable by other observers. Its career is private, different from the brain, right? We can take a person's body and put it in, an MRI, and we can watch different areas of the brain light up at different times, right? That's publicly observable. The mind, right, the Cartesian sense of mind, isn't. Ryle continues, only I can take direct cognizance of the states of affairs, of the states and processes of my own mind. A person, therefore, lives through two collateral histories. Now, this is on the Cartesian view. the physical stuff and the non-physical stuff. That's the two collateral histories that Ryle's getting ready to address here. The first is public, and oh, wait a second, I skipped over a line. One consisting of what happens in and to his body, and the other consisting of what happens in and to his mind. The first is public, the second private. The events in the first history are events in the physical world, those in the second are those of the mental world. And what the point of all of that, the point that Ryle is making here, is that it's an incomprehensible viewpoint, right? To suggest that there are these two independent worlds that somehow interact with one another is nonsensical. So again, that's going back to the question that Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia was asking in the 1640s. But of course, we're giving Gilbert Ryle credit for it. And that is a problem that goes by this name. It's a disparaging remark that Ryle used, referring to that model as the ghost in the machine, meaning that we can understand and we can explain the operation of a machine without adverting to some spiritual, mystical substance that's floating around inside of it, right? Whenever you go to explain how a computer works, you make reference to the memory chips and the motherboard and all the circuitry and all the peripherals and the keyboard and the monitor and the programming. And you don't say, in addition to all that stuff, there's this spiritual, gobbledygook that's going around on the inside of it that really makes the computer work, right? Well, that's nonsensical. We don't need to introduce something non-physical to explain the physical operation of a computer. We don't need to introduce something non-physical to explain the physical operation of a car, right? There's not some mysterious substance floating around in the car making it work. The car just works through a series of mechanical processes which are observable in the physical world, right? That's what, Ryle's going to be saying is the same is true of humans. That there is no ghost in the machine that's making us work, right? It's just the mechanical process. And notice that this, I was scrolling back to see if the word materialism was used in the title of section 3.9. It's not. But notice that this is a materialist viewpoint, right? This is arguing against the dualism of Descartes. Descartes is wanting to assert the existence of this spiritual stuff. And what Ryle's going to say is the spiritual stuff just doesn't exist, right? It's a ghost. It's just not there. Scrolling down here, a lot of the issues that he mentions in that pink highlighted paragraph are issues that arise from what Ryle sees as this misconceived notion and understanding of the mind, going back to at least to the time of Descartes, and we saw versions of this kind of dualism in Plato as well. And it brings up these questions that Ryle doesn't think are answerable within that dualist framework. If the mind and body are in reality two radically different substances, then how precisely do they connect to one another, right? This is Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia's question. The author of your textbook doesn't mention her once in the entirety of it. One of the most influential thinkers of her time, so famous in her own time that she was in correspondence with, her intellect was so widely regarded at the time that she was in correspondence with with Descartes, who obviously had that reputation of being a person of high intellect. And you don't have, people of high intellect, answering, letters from people that they don't, whose intelligence they don't respect. So the question is, how can the non-physical interact with the physical? Just as, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia had that question, Gilbert Ryle is asking that same question. And let's see here. I don't think I need to read those out loud. I'll let you read that on your own. This is just John Chafee making some commentary about the material that is in that pink highlighted passage. One of the things I want to talk about in this lecture video is mentioned here in this blue highlighted passage, what Ryle refers to as a category mistake. Ryle thinks that Descartes is making this category mistake. Whenever Descartes, whenever Descartes is asking this question about, well, what is mind? Ryle thinks that he's identified a kind of fallacy, a kind of mistaken reasoning, and he gives it a name. He calls it a category mistake. And he gives an explanation of the category mistake here, talking specifically about the ghost in the machine. That is the label of derision that he applies to Descartes' dualist philosophy. And Ryle uses this example of someone who comes to visit a college campus and says, hey, I'd love to see your college campus. And so you take the person on a tour of the college campus and say, well, here's the parking lot, here's the administrative buildings, here are the classes, here's one of the classrooms, that's one of the faculty members, here's the departmental office, here are the administrative assistants, here's where the president's office is, here's where the provost office is, here's where the student union is, and this is the library, and you walk them all around the college. And then at the end of that, the person that was asking to see your college says, well, that was great. I saw the buildings, I saw the classrooms, I saw the faculty members, I saw the administrative assistants, but where was the college? Now, the person who asks that question is guilty of what Ryle called the category mistake. And what Ryle's going to emphasize is that the college is not something over and above, the college is not something over and above the buildings and the classroom and the faculty members and the students. The college just is all of those things. So using that as an analogy back to this question of mind, well, what is mind? Well, Ryle's going to say mind is not something that's sort of floating above human experience and behavior. It just is human experience and behavior. And how do we connect with human experience and behavior? Well, through what we observe. And notice that, you can know a person's state of mind. How do you know someone's angry? Well, they're yelling, they're stomping their feet, right? They're gesticulating their arms, right? How do you know whenever someone's sad? They have that body posture that's sort of pulled in. How do you know whenever someone's happy? They got a big smile on their face, right? And you'll say to somebody, it's like, well, wow, why are you in such a good mood? Well, you're asking that because they're in a good mood. And how do you know they're in a good mood? Well, because of what you observed. And what did you observe? You didn't observe this mental stuff. You observed their physicality. You observed their behavior. And so that is what mind is, according to Ryle. So right here is where Ryle starts to sort of drive home what he is going to be getting at. What he describes here is the abandonment of the two-world legend. Abandoning dualism, right? Dualism is hopeless in terms of being able to answer questions about what mind is and what mind does, because it is operating on this fallacy of the category mistake, and we're adopting this ghost in the machine. So I'm going to go ahead and read this yellow highlighted passage here. Abandonment of the two-world legend involves the abandonment of the idea that there is a locked door and a still to be discovered key. That actually should be hyphenated right there, still be, because that's operating as a modifier of key, so it should be hyphenated. Sorry, my neurodivergence gets in the way of these live videos every once in a while. Those human actions and reactions, those spoken and unspoken utterances, those tones of voice, facial expressions, and gestures, which have always been the data of all students, of all this The data of all the other students of men have, after all, been seen as the right and only manifestations to study, right? You can't study a non-material mind. What can you study? You can study a brain, you can study human behavior, right? That's what we have access to. So why should we spend our time sort of rubbing our chins and contemplating this thing that we can't even demonstrate exists in the first place? A non-material mind, right? And so that's why Ryle's going to say, well, let's just jettison all of that and just focus on what we have available to us. And what do we have available to us? Our senses and what we can observe. And what is it that we're observing? We're observing people's behavior. They alone have merited, but fortunately not received, the grandiose title mental phenomena. So in the margins here, I wrote this note. I'll go ahead and read it. Ryle wants to shift the discussion about mind from the metaphysical to the epistemological. So remember, Descartes sees mind, the topic of mind, as a metaphysical issue. What kind of stuff is it? What Ryle is trying to do is trying to pull the question of mind back from the metaphysical realm and into the epistemological realm. How can I know your mental state? How can you know your best friend's mental state? Through what you observe. And what are you observing? You're observing their body language, you're observing their facial expressions, you're observing how they navigate the world, you're observing, are they, quickly, and whenever they're driving, are they driving fast and slamming on the brakes? Are they taking these wild turns? Or are they casual? Are they relaxed? Are they just going about their day, right? You can know a person's state of mind through what you're observing. And you're not observing this mystical stuff. You're observing a person's behavior. So to continue reading here, mind, if thought of as a kind of stuff, can't be analyzed or discussed in the public realm because we don't have access to that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff that dualists think comprise mind. We do, however, have access to what we can observe, and what we can observe is behavior. Now, the last thing I'll say in this video is an obvious criticism of the theory of behaviorism. The behaviorist is going to say that we have access to a person's mental state through what it is that we're observing, which is their behavior. But quite obviously, people are capable of behaving in a way that is not indicative of an inner mental state. I'm sure almost all of you have put on a smile and a happy face and gone to work, even if you were experiencing some emotional or psychological trauma at that time, right? People can act like nothing's wrong even when something's wrong. And people can act like something's wrong even when something's not wrong, right? Somebody can fake a limp. So you could see somebody walking down a sidewalk limping. And you could say, well, that person's leg hurts. Well, how do you know that person's leg hurts? Well, because I saw him limping. But that person could just be an actor who is, rehearsing for this role, engaged in some sort of method acting, exercise to help them get into character for this upcoming role that they're going to be playing. And so, since quite obviously somebody can have a smile on their face even when they're sad, quite obviously somebody can have a frown on their face when they're not sad, right? Somebody can have a grimace and a scowl even when they're not in pain. And that's what Rand Blanchard pointed out here in this pink highlighted passage. And I'm not going to read that, but what he's essentially doing there is pointing out is that from the behaviorist perspective, all a headache is a series of headache behaviors. And how do people with headaches behave? Well, they might wince at the light, right? You might see them rubbing their temples. You might see that person grab an aspirin and take it. Well, if all a headache is a collection of those types of behaviors, well, then that would mean that you could banish the headache simply by not doing that, by not wincing at the light, and by not rubbing your temples, and by not taking an aspirin. But that's clearly absurd, right? The reason I'm taking the aspirin is because I have a headache. The headache is not the same thing as the behavior of taking an aspirin. And so, for as good as behaviorism is at criticizing Descartes, it just doesn't give a good alternative to Descartes' position, which is why we're going to continue to go on to talk about a competing account of mind. But that's going to be in a different video. So for right now, I'm going to bring this video to a close, and I will see you in the next one.